There, I think you can hear me now. I'm going to be speaking to my slides, and then Darren will be using ASL when he does his part of the presentation. But feel free to ask questions in either language, and we will respond as we go through. So I'm very excited to be here and to share some information about the ASL Receptive Skills Test. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge a few people because none of this work could happen without support that we received in developing the test. So you see on the screen the photo of my research assistants many years ago when they were my graduate students, and they really did a lot of work in developing this assessment. And of course, we had to test many children in many different schools across Canada and the US. So we're very grateful for the parents allowing their children to participate and the schools giving us access to the children there to do the testing. And of course, none of this can happen without money. So I'm also want to acknowledge the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada that supported our work with funding. Okay, what we're going to cover today is a bit of background information about the test, and then we will go into details about how you administer the test, score it, and interpret those scores when you're working with children. And then hopefully we'll also have some time at the end for your questions. So as a background, there's a few reasons for testing children. The main one, I think, is to guide your teaching, to give you ideas of where children need more instruction. And that's really the key purpose for testing children. Although there are also times when you need to do tests to monitor whether what you've been doing with them has been effective or not, to see how they're progressing and learning. And of course, in our systems, there's often a need to justify maybe more support or to provide evidence around, that students need more funding or more services. And so assessments can provide that kind of evidence at times as well. But my point is that particularly for this type of test, which I'll talk about more as a standardized test, you don't want to spend too much time in a child's programming doing testing. What you really want to focus on is instruction and learning. Also, when we're looking at assessments, there's specifically for language, there's all different kinds of areas of language that different tests assess. And so, tests can be for receptive language, which means a child's understanding, comprehension of language, or a test can focus on a child's expressive skills, their use of that language, their signing abilities, in this case of ASL assessment. Tests can also be focused on different age levels, acquisition, very beginning levels, or later learning of language skills. And also, there are a lot of different components of language that tests can focus on. Vocabulary, grammar, discourse, that interaction, or storytelling, or different ways of presenting language, and pragmatics, sort of the rules for how we interact. So the receptive skills test is obviously a receptive test. So it's just measuring understanding of ASL. And it's geared to children in that 3 to 13 year range. So it's not for preschoolers just acquiring language. It's a little bit older in that school-aged range up to 13. And it specifically focuses on grammar. not those other components of ASL. So when you're doing a full assessment of a child, the ASL receptive skills test is only going to tell you about their understanding of ASL grammar. Okay, so be aware of that when you're determining which test to use. Okay, so here's a few other things about the ASL receptive skills test. It is a standardized test. I'll talk more about that, but it basically means it's a formal measure. You have to administer it in the same way, following the same procedures for each child. It is norm referenced, which means that it's based on norms from a group of children that we tested. In this case, there were 203 children between the ages of 3 to 13. They had a mixture of deaf and hearing parents, but they all had early exposure to ASL by the age of 3 years. And they all had nonverbal IQ, so their intelligence or their cognitive skills were in the average range, normal nonverbal IQ. Does that group, is it totally representative of deaf children? No, obviously not. We know that there's a lot more variability in the average groups of deaf children. But we created these norms, or we created the test based on these norms, because we want them to be what are sometimes referred to as aspirational norms, or a goal for deaf children. If they have full and rich exposure to ASL at an early age, this is what they're capable of doing, of understanding in terms of ASL grammar. So not all the children you test will have that same background, but hopefully it will show where they could be if they had that kind of access to language. Okay. Again, I mentioned it's receptive, the understanding of ASL. It focuses on grammar. There is a vocabulary pretest, which Darren will explain in more detail, which isn't a vocabulary test. It's just to make sure the child knows the vocabulary in the test, so that when they get a question wrong, you know it's because they didn't understand the grammar, not because they didn't understand the signs. Okay, but we'll explain that a little bit more. So the focus is grammar, and it's also a test that we adapted from the British Sign Language version of the test, and we adapted it into ASL. And it's obviously commercially available, and so that many teachers and schools can use it. Again, just a little bit more about standardized test. I mentioned that you have to do the test the same way for all children. If you adapt the administration, then you can't really apply the norms in the same way, because those are based on children who were tested in that standardized way. This test, standardized test, can be either criterion referenced or norm referenced. In the ASL-RST is norm referenced, so it's based on that group of students that were tested. Another important point about standardized tests is that they have been proven to be reliable, which means that you give the test several times, you'll get the same result. Okay, there's consistency there in terms of it's going to measure the same things. And validity means that the test measures what it says it measures. So we've also done the statistics and the analysis to show that this test does in fact measure a child's understanding of ASL. So it's valid in that way. Okay, one last thing about norms is this idea of the normal curve. You've probably seen this before, where basically normal is defined by what most people do, or what most children do in this case at certain ages. So that's how the standard scores are determined on the test. It's what most 3-year-olds will do with this question, okay? So you can see that 68% of the data falls in that normal range around the average, okay, around that peak of the normal curve. So that's what normal means, is that most children that age will score that way, okay? And then as you move away from that norm, it's either below average, going to the left of the curve, and then above average, going to the right of the curve, okay? So that's really how normal works. It's about what most children in that group, how they answered each question. And that's how we get the normal or the standard scores on the test. Lastly, I did say it was a test adaptation, and I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Rosalind Herman, from the UK, who developed with her team the British Sign Language version of the test, and we adapted it into ASL. Again, this was way back in 2009. It's been around for a while. Both tests have been around for a while, but they're still very effective measures of receptive understanding of sign language. And it facilitated our process by having a test that was already determined to be reliable and valid, and that we could just make sure that the same types of grammar markers would make sense in ASL as they did in British Sign Language. We obviously had to redo the whole video and redo all the pictures to fit, and we did a lot of pilot testing, but essentially it has been worked very well as an adaptation. Okay, now for the fun part, I'm going to hand it over to Darren to explain how the receptive skills test works and how you administer it.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Let me do a short explanation of who I am, a short introduction. My name is Darren Holst, and I work in education and have for 31 years as a consultant for school districts. And I've done that for 17 years. I've been in an outreach program. I've traveled to a lot of different schools. I've met a variety of deaf children and hard of hearing children all around Ontario. So, okay, we're ready to dive in and discuss the test. This is what it looks like. And it takes about 15 minutes to administer the test. So what you do is a child is watching a movie that's already been downloaded. It's someone that's signing, and they pick from a variety of answers. So the video will show the signing, and the child picks an answer of which picture they want to choose. And the test has 8 categories: grammar, numbers, number distribution, negation, noun and verbs, spatial, classifiers and verbs, shapes, size, that's related to shape, size, and specific classifiers, and how to use classifiers, comb, knife, things like that. Conditionals, we have 8 of those. And the test also includes a pretest. There are 3 practices that we use to see if we can administer the test to the child or not, based on the pretest vocabulary, as well as the 3 practice tests. And if things go well, then we go ahead and do the 42 different items on the test. The 42 are part of different categories on the test, the 42 items. Thank you. I clicked and Charlotte clicked too. So, okay. Charlotte says, I'll do that. I'm sorry, Darren, I'll do that. Okay, perfect. So the purpose of the pretest, let's talk about that for a minute. That's to make sure that the child is aware of the vocabulary and the signs that will be used on the pretest. I'm sorry, that will be included in the test and the pictures. So the child takes the pretest to make sure that they understand the terminology that will be used. If there are mistakes, if the child doesn't understand it, maybe they don't know the grammar or the structure, or maybe they don't understand the sign. All of those are possibilities. And so then they can choose the vocabulary. So let me show you what that looks like. Here's what the pictures are. And there are 20 cards. They're like 20 flashcards. So if you feel like the child doesn't have any sign language at all, then you would wait until the child did know the signs, and then you could proceed with the test to see if they could identify the vocabulary. And this pretest takes about 5 minutes. Sure, sure. So you would say, you would ask the child to sign this table, and there's a checklist for this pretest. And if the child doesn't know, or maybe they use a different sign, you would make note of that as well. So, if the child isn't exactly sure, you could ask them to try and to take a guess what they think the item is, and have the child give an answer to what they think this picture is on the flashcard. We're going to show you this real short clip of the vocabulary pretest. So those were examples of what you just saw. They would give the child the card, and then they're making check marks next to the words that the child recognizes. If the child does not respond or responds wrong, you would set that card in a different pile. And then when the test is finished, and you would count the errors. If there's one card, that's fine. Then you could, pick several other cards and lay them out, and the test administrator would sign that. Like, for example, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Like this picture. It's a picture of a boy, but if the child said father, you would mark that wrong, and you would write in the note to say that the child said father, and then you would set that card aside. And then later, when the test was done, you would lay out the cards, a variety of cards, and you would sign boy and have the child look through the pictures and see if they could identify the picture of the boy, to see if they could recognize the sign. And that's how you would proceed with the cards that the child made errors on. So if you've checked it off and there's an error, if there are more than 5 errors, then they can't proceed with the actual test. Okay. This is an example of the check sheet that's used, and then the comment if the child signs something incorrectly. Like we just said, if the child would sign father instead of boy, then you would put father in the comments. And then recognized sign. You would check that, and if they still didn't recognize it, then you would leave that blank. Then you would score that. There should be 20. Remember, we're emphasizing if there's 5 wrong, then the child can't proceed with that test. Okay, so let me tell you how this works. It's one-on-one, one child and one test administrator, and it would be in a room that didn't have any distractions, no visual distractions, like no toys, nothing like that, a very simple, plain room. And we would make sure that the child was comfortable and could see both the laptop or computer as well as the administrator. And we would have to make sure that the test was in the child's line of vision. And they should sit next to the administrator so that the administrator can observe the child watching and make sure that they're actually participating with the video. And you can redirect the child if they get distracted. You can redirect them towards the test or the video. And you give them time to choose their answer. And make sure that you're always smiling and very positive with the child. And if they make a mistake or they're correct, just continue smiling. Always be positive during this test. And the child sometimes will watch the administrator's facial expressions to see if they got that wrong, and then they might change their answer. So try really hard to sit there and just smile, even if they're right or wrong. Just nod your head and smile and be very encouraging. Try not to give them any cues so that they know to change their answer or would be cued in to choose a different answer. Okay, the test itself has a USB, and I'll show you that. It just looks like this, a simple USB, and that's included, that includes the woman signing the 42 items. And that test takes about 10 to 20 minutes to get through, depending on the age of the child. If they're really young, it might take a little bit longer, and if they're a little bit older, it might go quicker. It's very important in the beginning of the test to explain how the test is going to work. And then do the 3 practices. That's important so the child can see. Make sure that you see if the child knows how to point to the pictures. If not, you might need a repetition of the explanation. And you can do these 3 practices, and you need to make sure that the child is pointing to the correct answer. And if they understand, then you would proceed with the test. If the practice questions aren't working out so well, if they make perhaps all 3 mistakes, then you would not run the test with that child. Okay. So again, the video, you don't repeat the video for the child. You can't do that. With younger children who are 3 or 4, I guess it would depend. You might do a repetition once, and then you would not go back again, just once. And with an older child, you would just let them see that once. You would not go back again. If there are special needs, perhaps they are have ASD or they have a cognitive delay, then you would have to have further consideration about whether or not you would let the child rewatch that. And you'd have to figure out what the best accommodation for that child would be. It might be hard for them to see. So I might sign what's on I might copy sign what was on the video for them and then point, that would be another option, but I would encourage you not to do that. And there is no time limit on this test. If they're watching for 5 seconds or more, you would encourage the child to give their best guess. But again, there's no time limit. And if they were dragging on and on, you would just encourage the child to guess. If they're overwhelmed or get distracted, you can certainly pause the test and then start again, maybe that same week. You don't want a lot of time to lapse between the first part of the test and then pausing and then the second part. If they answer and it's correct and they get 4 in a row, and then they start making mistakes and they're making mistakes repeatedly, you would stop the test. If they get 1 right and then 2 wrong and then 1 right, that's fine. But if they get 4 in a row incorrect, then you would stop the test. When the test is done, you don't do it again right away. You have to wait longer than 6 months before you retest the child with the RST. Okay. Make sure that the child doesn't see the score sheet, because there are A, B, C, and D on the test. And there are 4 blocks. There's A and B, and then C and D under them. So it goes A, B, and then under C, D. And there are circling. You're circling the answers. Make sure that the child doesn't see the paper. You can use a clipboard to block the child's view from the scoring. Um, you know, um, they're bolded. That would denote the correct answer. That's how you'll know which answer is correct, A, B, C, or D. And be careful, again, not to use facial expressions if they answer incorrectly or correctly. Just nod your head and smile and keep going. This is an example that we'd like to show you. Okay, so you see the woman signing. That's one of the people from the research team that you saw in the very beginning. It's the same woman who signs all 42 items throughout the entire test. You see her signing, and then you see the four pictures, the four choices, and the child could point, and then you would do the circling on the answer key or the answer sheet, the score sheet. And it's important again to list the child's background, whether or not their parents signed, if they were exposed to ASL early, document that information about the child. And then that will help us assess the child if they have sign at home, if they had early exposure, or if they have not had any exposure to ASL. So that's important information for us. In the comment section, the test, you'll see a comment section in the test, and you can record if the child was sick, if they were paying attention, if they were distracted, maybe a fire alarm went off. Please document that as well. Anything that might have disrupted their attention. And maybe the child has, for example, autism or cerebral palsy. If you could document that too, that would be perfect. And make sure as well, there are 8 different categories, and there's a column for right and column for wrong. And after you circle that, make sure that the numbers match. Sometimes it will be number 2, and it will need to match what it, like a classifier. 8 would be a classifier, and then 2, you would go back and check that. So you have to make sure that you've gotten those matched specifically, and those are aligned. That you have to be very careful on. Sometimes when I'm doing it, I have to, double check, triple check my work to make sure that I have actually matched those different columns. So be very careful with that work. And then when that's done, you will get a raw score. You'll total the raw score, and you'll see the spreadsheet, and it will translate to a standardized score. And you'll find the raw score and the age, and then those will meet, and then that will give you the standardized score. You'll see the scoring sheet, the chart. Okay. Sometimes when you're proceeding with the test, something will happen, something will go awry, but maybe it will be an environmental influence. Maybe it'll be a really busy day, or it'll be a busy environment, and the child will be distracted. Maybe the child will take a long time to do the test. The test itself um, is the test itself, maybe the child's not ready. Just we need to make sure that you're prepared before you give the test and that you're ready. And again, with the vocabulary words, make sure that those are ready. And the child, their exposure to ASL, whether or not it was early exposure, maybe they had late exposure to ASL, maybe they have other special needs. Maybe they have developmental issues or learning difficulties. So all of that should be made note of. All right, I'm turning it back over to Charlotte. Thank you.
Okay, so that's an understanding of how you give the test. It's pretty straightforward. All the materials are video recorded, so you just have to note how the child responds. But then what does it mean once you've got this score? So the raw score is simply how many the child got right out of the 42 test items. Okay. And so it can tell you a little bit about how the child is doing just compared to themselves, right? And so sometimes when you maybe had to adapt the scoring a little bit, like you had to sign the items again yourself, or you maybe needed to show the pictures in a enlarged form for children that can't see as well, or maybe the child is beyond the age range of the test, so you're not following the exact standardized score. Sometimes you just want to use that raw score as a way of measuring how the child has done, because you can't really compare their score to the standardized score. Okay, so that's one of the ways that you can use the raw score. But it tells you how they did, which items they got right and wrong gives you a basic understanding of the grammar categories where they might have a strength or a weakness. And it allows you to compare their score to their previous scores if they were tested before, but it doesn't let you compare how they did relative to other children their age or other children in the normative group. That's what you need the raw score for, and that's why you need to convert it to that. So this is the you can also get a lot of information from this pattern of correct and incorrect responses that Darren was explaining, that you have to manually go from the score form that you checked off and put those scores into these columns on the front of the score sheet. So where it says the pattern of correct, incorrect responses, you'll see all the grammar categories listed in one column and then correct or incorrect. And this sample here shows how this student did. So what does this tell you? Okay. And again, it's more like a screening test, the receptive skills test, than an in-depth assessment because some of the grammar items only have a few items, as you can see. But you can tell that this child did quite well with or did had a lot of mistakes in number distribution. And the going through that list, they only got one of them right and all the rest wrong, even the earlier developing ones, the ones that come first in the test. So that's a real area of difficulty for this student and something you'd want to work on. The same you can't say the same for negation. Look at how they scored with the negative items. So there you can see they got most of those right. A couple of them they had difficulty with, but you might also notice that some of those negation items are also have two different grammar structures tested in them. And those are marked with the items that have circles around them in that last column. So you'll see how some of the items have a circle. That means it's negation plus another grammar skill. So if they got it wrong, you have to check if, maybe they understood the negative negation part, but not the other part. In that case, the conditional might be the problem or that sort of thing. So this gives you a little bit more of an assessment that way. So number distribution, something they need to work on. Negation is developing well. Noun verb distribution, it's kind of half and half. So again, you would see, are they doing fairly well for their age, their standard score? Then maybe you're not too worried about noun verbs. Spatial verbs, again, they're getting most of the earlier developing ones and having trouble with the later developing spatial verbs, both for location and or for location and action. Although here they're getting most of those correct. So again, that's not a real concern. The spatial verbs, size and shape specifiers, it's again half and half. So they might be needing some work there, but that might also be appropriate for their age. The handling classifiers, they're getting them all correct, so that's good. Role shift, which is a later developing grammar structure, they only got one of those correct, so that might be something to work on. Conditionals, though, they did get correct. And you'll see their standard score is in the average range. So overall, this child is developing a good understanding of ASL skills, but might need some work in number distribution and maybe a little bit in role shift and some of the later developing spatial verbs. That's how you kind of look through and analyze that chart. Okay.
And this is
Yes.
Darren speaking. If I can add something, Darren speaking. So The items you have that are listed there, the test itself, they're not in that order. Sometimes they're mixed up as far as the order. So number one might apply to one part and another one might apply to another category of the test. Just an FYI for that, when you're transferring one to the other, they might mix up a little bit. And then also, for an example, that would be the negation. So for me, I do notice that there is one sign, glasses, and then there's a negative head shake like this, and it means that they missed the negative head shake, which means it's a negation, which means no glasses. So that helps to clarify that that actually is a no or a not because of that negative negation. So to be able to change that to not, they haven't been able to do it yet. Maybe you could say not yet or never. So those things are not exactly in the same order to be able to see which negation you have to fit the ID as far as which one, that they may miss because of that facial marker.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What are the grammatical features that differ within that category, where children might be better with the direct negative signs. They understand that, the never, the not, but they don't understand or they're not picking up on just the head shake, the not more non-manual parts of the sign of the grammar structure. Good point. Okay, so this is the uh, chart that Darren was referring to that allows you to find the standard score. So this applies directly to the norms and lets you determine whether the child fits into the normal range or is below average or above average. So you would find their age at the top of the chart here from 3 to 13, and then their raw score down the first column and where they meet. So if it's a 6-year-old child that got 22, you look for where they meet. 22, you follow it right into the middle here. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but I'm using my cursor at 104. So what does 104 mean? 100 is average on a standard score, okay? And the standard deviations or the range within the normal are 15 above and 15 below. So 85 to 115 is the normal range. And you'll see that down here in the legend, okay? So average is going from not eight below 100 to 85 and above average to 114 actually. So those are both in the average range, above and below, slightly below average or slightly below the mean, but still in the average range. Okay. And then if you get a score that falls outside of those, below 84 is below average, and above 115 is above average. If you get a score that's below 70, more than two standard deviations below the mean, that's extremely delayed score, okay? And the same with the above average. If it's above 130, they're very, very well above average, extremely outstanding for their age. Okay. So that's what the standard score is. It goes around the mean of 100. And then just like that normal distribution curve moves out from there. And this chart helps you find that. So all that the total raw score tells you, and then converting it to the standard score simply tells you where they fall, where the child falls within that normal curve. And you want to look at some of the structures and those grammar categories to find out a little bit more about where they might need some instruction and where they might be doing very well, which grammar structures they understood really well, and which ones they might need some support and work on. Okay.
And this is
Add,
Darren speaking. If I can add something, a couple of more things. So during the presentation, a couple of things came to mind here, and I thought, oh my goodness, it's really important to be able to share these things. So one of them would be during the testing process, if the child for some time is really, really fast to point and quickly realize, oh, wait a minute, it was the other picture. That kind of thing may happen, and they need to point to that one. You still jot that down, circle it, and then you draw it up and you circle the correct one next to it as far as the second one. And it still counts as correct because it is a correct answer. So when you put that down, it does help. Often, children will point to one first and they go, oh, wait a minute, and change my mind. I want to point to the one that's really right. So, and then sometimes once they calm a minute, they watch it, but they can make that choice. And then the other thing I would like to mention is periodically it does happen where the children, for example, a woman assigned the word ball on a table, a ball or table, and the child will look at fast and go, oh, that's a picture. And you have to say, wait till she's done with her whole, concept or whatever she's signing. And then they do it again. And so we have to remind the children to wait, watch until the whole thing is completed, and then pick the right picture.
yeah, thanks for adding that. I also want to say if the child changes their answer from the right one to the wrong one, you still have to indicate that second answer as their final answer, even though it's wrong. But it's good again to
Yes,
note
correct.
it's good to note that they they're obviously unsure, and it shows that their understanding of that structure is emerging. They maybe think the right one, but they're not quite sure yet, so they change it to the wrong. So if you circle both of those and then indicate which one was the last one, it kind of helps you to know, okay, they're on the verge of getting this, they're getting close. That's a good thing, even though their answer was wrong. They don't get a point for it.